When Judge Beryl Howell first leaned forward on the bench and spoke in a tone meant to cut through the air like a blade, most people in the courtroom assumed that Jasmine Crockett would respond like so many others had before, by shrinking back, lowering her voice, or simply conceding ground. Howell had a reputation for using her presence as much as her rulings to establish control. It was not unusual for her to interrupt mid-sentence, to raise an eyebrow in a way that could make even experienced attorneys second-guess themselves. That style of intimidation had worked countless times before. But on this day, Crockett revealed that composure itself can be the most disarming response. Rather than meeting Howell's force with force, she adjusted her papers carefully, almost as if to buy herself a moment of calm. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, and in doing so, she made it clear that she wouldn't be pulled into a contest of volume or speed. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady, her words deliberate. The contrast between Howell's sharp delivery and Crockett's measured cadence was striking, and the courtroom noticed. Where one voice demanded compliance, the other invited respect simply by refusing to waver. Howell tried again. She interjected, reframing Crockett's point in a way that seemed designed to minimize it. Many might have panicked, worried that the judge's phrasing would stick, that her authority would drown out any attempt to clarify. But Crockett showed no sign of fluster. Instead, she looked directly at Howell, nodded slightly, and restated her argument with careful precision, using almost the same words as before but weaving in a reference to established legal standards. She didn't fight the interruption head-on, she simply recentered the discussion with such calm control that the original point now stood taller than before. That was the moment when people in the room began to shift in their seats. They realized they weren't just watching a lawyer holding her own. They were witnessing a kind of quiet strength that made intimidation ineffective. By not reacting emotionally, Crockett subtly turned the dynamic around. The judge's sharpness, once the dominant force in the room, now seemed to highlight just how unshaken she was. Each calm response became a silent demonstration that authority alone could not dictate the truth of an argument. This balance between pressure and composure is what separates those who survive in a courtroom from those who command it. Crockett didn't ignore Howell's tone, she acknowledged it with her steady presence. She didn't try to outmatch the judge's intensity, she let that intensity contrast with her own poise. And in that contrast, she carved out a space of credibility that couldn't be ignored. As the exchanges continued, Howell seemed to notice. Her challenges came just as sharply, but there was an edge of recognition beginning to form. Crockett wasn't bending, and she wasn't posturing. She was showing, moment by moment, that calm endurance can be more persuasive than theatrics. That realization changed the energy in the room. Even those who had entered expecting Howell's voice to be the final authority found themselves listening more carefully to Crockett's measured answers. Composure in such moments is not about silence or passivity. It is about control, control of voice, control of pace, control of one's own thoughts under fire. Crockett embodied that control. By holding herself steady when most would have faltered, she shifted not only Howell's perception but also the perception of everyone present. In a setting where intimidation was often used as a tool, Crockett showed that respect is won not by overpowering an opponent but by never allowing oneself to be overpowered. From the very start of the exchange, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett's strength was not only her composure but her deep understanding of the law itself. Judge Beryl Howell had built much of her courtroom authority on the assumption that her knowledge would outweigh anyone who appeared before her. She carried herself as someone who always had the sharper precedent, the firmer grasp on statutes, the more commanding interpretation. But Crockett revealed that knowledge, when used with precision, can level even the most uneven playing field. When Howell pressed her with a procedural question, it was not just meant to clarify, it was meant to corner her. Many attorneys, when faced with such questions, stumble into long-winded explanations that open more holes than they close. Crockett, however, answered with direct citations, referencing not just a single ruling but a chain of precedent that supported her stance. She wove together case law, legislative intent, and practical application, building her argument piece by piece in a way that made it nearly impossible to dismiss. Howell's interjection, meant to expose weakness, instead gave Crockett the opportunity to showcase strength. What stood out most was how natural it appeared. Crockett did not seem to be reaching for obscure references or rehearsed lines.
Her delivery suggested that these rulings, these statutes, these interpretations, were simply part of her working vocabulary. She carried the law in her mind as fluidly as others carry casual conversation. Each citation was paired with context, not just a name and a year but a clear explanation of how it applied. This demonstrated not only recall but true understanding. Howell, who had likely expected hesitation, found herself listening as Crockett turned what could have been a trap into a teaching moment. It was here that the balance in the room began to shift more noticeably. Knowledge does not shout, it illuminates. Crockett's calm but thorough answers brought clarity, and clarity has a way of silencing tension. For the audience present, it became harder to see Howell as the sole authority. Crockett had shown that authority rests not only in position but in the ability to explain, defend, and ground arguments in undeniable fact. Each time Howell tried to question her reasoning, Crockett answered with another layer of legal grounding, leaving little room for rebuttal. What made this exchange so significant was that Crockett did not attempt to overwhelm Howell with volume or speed. She did not drown her in citations to appear impressive. Instead, she used her knowledge as a steady foundation, returning to it again and again like bedrock. No matter how Howell framed her challenge, Crockett anchored her answers in principle, not personality. That is what made it so effective. A raised voice can be contested, but solid precedent cannot be easily moved. Howell, of course, continued to press. Her style demanded persistence, and she was not about to concede openly. Yet, each question seemed to reveal not Crockett's weakness but her depth. When Howell shifted toward questioning interpretation, Crockett responded with legislative history. When Howell pressed on procedural detail, Crockett walked through the rule step by step, as though she had rehearsed it her entire life. This adaptability showed a mastery that could not be staged. Howell's attempts to intimidate now looked less like dominance and more like a stage on which Crockett was quietly demonstrating brilliance. Observers in the courtroom could see it too. The rhythm of the exchange had changed. Instead of watching for cracks in Crockett's answers, people began leaning in to follow her reasoning. She was not only defending herself against pressure, she was teaching through her responses. That shift, from defense to instruction, marked the moment her knowledge transcended argument and became authority in its own right. Knowledge, in Crockett's hands, was not just a shield but a tool. It allowed her to redirect Howell's challenges, to reshape the narrative of the exchange, and to assert her presence without aggression. What Howell discovered that day was that titles and robes can command silence, but they cannot substitute for genuine expertise. Crockett's grasp of the law proved that when knowledge is complete, it carries its own kind of power, one that even intimidation cannot shake. The courtroom has always been a place where authority seems absolute. The bench sits higher, the robe carries centuries of tradition, and the gavel is a symbol that what is spoken there carries finality. Judge Beryl Howell understood that dynamic well. She leaned into it, using her stature and her reputation to remind anyone who appeared before her that she held the upper hand. Most people accepted that without question. They lowered their gaze, shortened their answers, and allowed her authority to set the terms of the exchange. But Jasmine Crockett's presence that day revealed a subtle truth: authority can be challenged, not through rebellion, but through undeniable competence. From the opening moments, Howell assumed that her voice would dominate the proceeding. Her sharp tone and interruptions were designed to remind Crockett of her place. Yet, as Howell delivered her challenges, something unexpected unfolded. Crockett did not resist with defiance, nor did she retreat in submission. Instead, she met every test with a balance of respect and clarity. She acknowledged Howell's questions but responded in ways that made clear she would not be reduced to silence. In doing so, she demonstrated that authority is not simply about position, it is about the ability to withstand pressure without losing one's center. At one point, Howell pushed with a line of questioning that was almost dismissive, as if to reduce Crockett's argument to little more than speculation. Many in the room recognized the tactic. It was the kind of move that often ended exchanges quickly, leaving the judge's voice as the final word. But Crockett countered not with emotion but with reasoning so tightly constructed that it left no room to be brushed aside. She cited relevant cases, walked through procedural frameworks, and drew connections that highlighted not only her grasp of the issue but also the weakness in Howell's dismissal. In that moment, the dynamic shifted.
What was intended to shut her down instead placed her on equal ground. The beauty of Crockett's approach was in how natural it appeared. She never raised her voice, never broke into theatrics, never turned her answers into speeches meant to impress the audience. She simply stayed rooted in the law. That choice made her presence even stronger. By refusing to be pulled into the rhythm of intimidation, she established her own rhythm, one that Howell had no choice but to engage with. In a space where authority usually silenced challenge, Crockett's steady insistence on substance became a quiet form of resistance. Observers began to notice the contrast. Howell, accustomed to her challenges ending debates, found herself pressed into listening. Crockett's answers, layered and precise, demanded consideration. Authority, in that instant, was no longer one-directional. Howell still held the gavel, but Crockett held something just as powerful, credibility built on substance. This balance did not overturn the structure of the courtroom, but it revealed its limits. Even the highest seat in the room could not dismiss truth when it was articulated with such clarity. It is rare to see such a moment play out in real time, the moment when authority realizes it has encountered an equal. Howell's posture remained stern, but the subtle cues were there, the pauses that lingered longer than before, the slightly narrower phrasing of her questions, the hint of recognition in her tone. Crockett had not only answered, she had proven that respect cannot be commanded solely by title. It must also be earned by meeting another's skill. For those watching, the lesson was unmistakable. Authority is powerful, but it is not infallible. It can be tested and, when tested with true ability, it must acknowledge the challenger. Crockett never sought to overthrow Howell's role, nor did she deny the structure of the courtroom. What she did was even more striking, she showed that authority cannot exist in a vacuum. It is only as strong as its ability to withstand those who can meet it with equal command. When Judge Beryl Howell spoke, her words carried the weight of position and expectation. She was accustomed to seeing people fold under that weight, giving her the sense that authority alone was enough to command every space. In her courtroom, most individuals responded to her sharpness with nervous apologies or hurried explanations. But Jasmine Crockett's response to him revealed something different, a quiet strength that didn't need to match Howell's tone to be effective. Instead of rushing or reacting defensively, she delivered her arguments with a steadiness that spoke louder than any display of force. From the first interruption, Howell's approach seemed to be designed to rattle her. He cut her off, reformulated her point in a way that reduced it, and challenged her with questions that bordered on dismissive. Anyone else might have raised their voice, trying to reassert control, or grown visibly frustrated. Crockett did neither. She paused, gathered her thoughts, and spoke with calm precision. That restraint carried its own kind of power. Without ever having to announce it, she showed that she could not be provoked into losing her ground. The strength she projected was not loud or aggressive. It was in the way she allowed silence to work in her favor, in the way her voice remained steady even as Howell's grew pointed. Each time he expected her to stumble or retreat, she simply responded with clarity. That quiet steadiness became noticeable to everyone in the room. It was not weakness, it was resolve. By not reacting to his pressure with visible strain, she shifted the perception of the exchange. Howell's attempts at dominance now looked like noise against the backdrop of her composure. What made this strength even more powerful was that it was consistent. One moment of calm could be dismissed as luck, but Crockett maintained it throughout the back and forth. Every time Howell tried to escalate, she responded with the same measured tone. She didn't match his intensity, and she didn't let her own words become defensive. Instead, she grounded every answer in the law, in reasoning, and in fairness. That kind of repetition built credibility. Observers began to realize that her steadiness was not just a tactic, it was part of her character. It is often said that people remember not just what is argued, but how it is argued. In that room, Howell's sharpness was memorable, but Crockett's quiet strength left the deeper impression. There was a sense that she could not be forced off balance, that she could hold her position without raising her volume or resorting to spectacle. This was strength in its most disciplined form, the kind that reveals itself not in bursts but in endurance. Howell seemed to recognize this as the exchange went on. His questions, still firm, carried a subtle change in rhythm. They no longer landed with the certainty that the person in front of him would falter. Instead, there was a hesitation, as though he knew each question might only provide another opportunity for her to demonstrate clarity. That recognition is what made Crockett's quiet strength so striking.
She didn't defeat Howell in a dramatic confrontation.
She simply stayed steady long enough that even he could not deny it.
For those in the courtroom, the lesson was easy to see.
True strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it is revealed in the refusal to be shaken, in the decision to remain composed when provoked, and in the discipline to let substance speak louder than style. Crockett showed that in spaces where authority often depends on intimidation, quiet strength can carry greater weight. As the session drew to a close, what lingered in the room was not the sharpness of Judge Beryl Howell's voice, but the quiet authority Jasmine Crockett had carried throughout. The difference between the two was striking. Howell had entered expecting her presence and her tone to set the boundaries, but Crockett's presence had proven something deeper, that authority without substance is fragile, and that true respect comes from knowledge, composure, and strength that does not waver under pressure. What made the exchange so memorable was not that Howell lost control of the courtroom, she did not. She still held her seat, her gavel, and the weight of her position. Yet within that setting, Crockett established herself as more than just another participant. She showed that her command of the law, her ability to remain calm, and her quiet strength could challenge even the most dominant figure in the room. The balance of respect had shifted, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it in real time, right before the eyes of everyone watching. For Howell, it was a reminder that intimidation can only go so far. A sharp question can unsettle, an interruption can redirect, but when the person on the other side is grounded in truth and knowledge, those tactics begin to lose their effect. Crockett's brilliance forced Howell to engage with her not as someone to be dismissed but as an equal, and in that shift lay the true power of the moment. It was less about confrontation and more about revelation, the discovery that real genius cannot be overshadowed, no matter the setting. For those in the courtroom, and for anyone who hears the story, the lesson is enduring.
Power is not always in the loudest voice. It is not always in the highest seat.
Sometimes, the most powerful presence is the one that never falters, that stays steady even when pressed, and that answers with reason instead of reaction.
Crockett embodied that lesson.
Her presence showed that legal genius does not need theatrics to be seen, it reveals itself quietly, piece by piece, until it is undeniable. And perhaps that is why the moment carried such weight. In a world where authority often goes unquestioned, it is rare to see someone stand with such balance, respecting the bench, yet refusing to be diminished by it. Crockett did not seek to overpower Howell, she simply showed, through patience and mastery, that she belonged in any legal arena, no matter who sat across from her. When the gavel finally came down, the courtroom returned to order, but the memory of the exchange lingered. Those present would not forget the composure, the knowledge, the strength, and the quiet confidence that had transformed what could have been a routine display of authority into something much more significant. Judge Beryl Howell may have entered the room expecting to intimidate, but she left having encountered something far greater, the undeniable legal